Welcome everyone, it's good to see you. As you probably noticed, it's been a while since I last recorded, so it's nice to be back once again sharing these teachings. And what I'd like to focus on this month is the key yogic concept of what is known in Sanskrit as vairagyam, which in English is loosely translated as detachment. And this is one of the most key and important practices or concepts, if you like, that's offered in the Yoga Sutras as a way of understanding the fact that in the day-to-day, in our day-to-day lives, we can find ourselves incredibly attached to everything that's going on around us. In fact, it's fair to say that if we let our minds wander without any sense of needing to bring them in, we soon get lost in the circumstances of our lives, and we soon get lost in the thoughts about our lives. That is to say that we identify so much with the things that are going on around us, we identify so much with our thoughts that we lose connection to anything else, and we actually end up beginning to believe or feel that we are the circumstances of our lives, or we are the thoughts. And what Patanjali essentially tells us is that detachment is our ability to be able to step back from the thoughts, our ability to be able to take a step deeper within inside ourselves as we are going through the circumstances of life, and to be able to connect to a place deeper within ourselves that is unaffected essentially by the circumstances arising in our lives, and that is unaffected by the thoughts that so frequently pass through our minds. And so essentially what he's saying is that we need to practice and have practices available to us that enable us to be able to discriminate between the transient nature of the circumstances in our lives, no matter how permanent we think something is. Perhaps something difficult's going on at work, perhaps something difficult's going on in a relationship that you have, perhaps even something that's been going on for a very, very long time and feels quite intractable. All of these things give the illusion of permanence. But the reality is that all of them are part of this transient, or part of what is called parinama, the change which is inevitable in all things. But somehow we begin to believe or feel that these things are permanent. And so we spend more and more time thinking about how we can resolve them, rather than necessarily stepping back and taking a moment just to observe what is arising and to discriminate between that which is transient and that which is permanent. And what yoga talks about as being permanent is the light within consciousness, perhaps, of what is called purusha in yogic philosophical terminology, which is basically a place within us where we can observe what is going on, but that is unaffected by the content of the experience. So in other words, when we talk about detachment, we are actually talking about detaching from over-identifying with the transient and superficial, and actually identifying with something deeper, which is unchanging, and which, as we've said, is not affected by the content of experience. Now, what does that actually mean in terms of how we begin to cultivate that? How do we sit deeper within inside ourselves? How do we sit in a place that is actually unaffected by the circumstances of our lives? And by the way, being unaffected by the circumstances of our lives doesn't mean that we're not connected to the circumstances of our lives. Doesn't mean that we don't feel the circumstances of our lives, but it means that we can sit in a place that does not get so deeply affected by them, and therefore we are able to cultivate equanimity even in the midst of a storm. So how do we practice this? Well, actually, the ability to step onto a yoga mat is actually our first practice in detachment. And this is why. The reason is that in order to practice, in order to step on the mat, we have to detach from whatever we are doing. Now, even if we have a beautiful intention to practice yoga on a regular basis, we may often find that we're doing anything but actually practicing. We find ourselves having a cup of tea, we find ourselves on social media, we find ourselves watching something on YouTube, whatever it might be. We always find something that doesn't involve practicing. And that is because of our attachment to those patterns, the patterns that have been perpetuated in our lives over many, many decades, which mean that when it actually comes to deciding, yes, I'm going to practice, what are called these samskaras, or these subconscious patterns in our mind, are so strong and so prominent that we're unable to break their hold, and so therefore we end up falling back into that same groove time and time again, and therefore no practice gets done. If, however, we actually end up on the mat, what that means is that we have managed in that moment of time to detach from the mental patterns that were causing us to do other things. We have sacrificed those things in order to move closer to this practice of stepping onto the mat and maybe breathing or meditating or moving, whatever it may be in our practice. And the beautiful thing about this is that the more that we practice, the more that we need to detach. And the more we detach, the easier we find it to step onto the mat and practice. And so it becomes somewhat of a virtuous cycle where the practice enforces or reinforces our capacity to detach. And the detachment then means that in our practice, we're able to go deeper because, of course, the story doesn't end there. Once you're on the mat, of course, you may be practicing, but are you fully present with what you are doing? Because, of course, again, the mind continues to act according to previous patterns. So the mind starts to get scattered, the mind starts to think about what you're going to do after practice, your mind starts to think about whether any important messages, for example, have arrived whilst you're practicing. And so then what we need to do on the mat is begin to reinforce the pattern of detachment by, whenever those distracting thoughts arise in our minds, rather than nourishing those thoughts with our attention, rather than hooking into those thoughts and energizing them, we simply smile at them, let them go, and come back to what we're doing. And that, in and of itself, is also a practice of detachment. So you can say, actually, whenever you're meditating, the ultimate goal in meditation is to practice detaching from the distractions and practice anchoring in to the object of the meditation, which might be breath or sensations or an image or a visualization, whatever it might be. And the beautiful thing about this is that over time, the more that we practice this form of detachment, this form of vairagya, it actually means that we become much, much more skillful at noticing when our mind has started to frequent what we might call negative thinking patterns, negative thought patterns, negative emotions, and so on. And rather than just on autopilot allowing ourselves to just dwell in that negative space, we realize that our mind has become attached to something which perhaps is not so useful or healthy for us in that moment, that has no relationship to the present moment, and we simply detach from it and come back into the present moment. And after all, yoga is very much the practice of presence, because it is only in presence and with a clear mind that we are able to transcend the thoughts and transcend the body and connect to that space of peace within us. So in summary, vairagya is a very, very important practice in all areas of our lives, but we can start to cultivate this vairagya or detachment by stepping onto the mat and being comfortable with letting go of whatever we need to let go of in order that we can actually sustain our practice. And over time, we can feel the benefit of this vairagya in just generally being less disturbed by our thoughts, being able to concentrate better, and as a result, being able to go even deeper and more profoundly into our practices. So as always, it's a pleasure to share these teachings with you. It's great to be back once again, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.